And of course, the most intelligent people, the very learned people of that time, were the ones who watched the skies, who recorded it. There was astrology. And by the way, I find it comical that modern astronomy, which poo-poos astrology, modern astronomy poo-poos astrology, which was the original source for measuring the position of stars and the patterns and the time patterns, etc. So at any rate, it's very interesting that back then they had astrology and they followed the stars very closely. The kings would not make a move. They would not attack in battle. They would not make a big decision based if there was a bad moon or if there was a other condition that was contrary to astrological beliefs. They did a lot of decision making based on astrology and the stars and positions of the stars. But at any rate, they also measured things. They also tracked things. They knew the repetition rate of the solar eclipses and lunar eclipses, and they could predict them. They had all kinds of information. But at any rate, okay, so now we have Venus the comet migrating, moving away from Jupiter, out in the sky, and becoming a bigger and bigger comet, something very visible from Earth, and not just a nice little, let's say, neat comet like Hale-Bopp, which even was a relatively medium-sized comet. Venus was a pretty wild comet, from what we understand. At one point, it had as many as 14 tails, all flailing around wildly in the sky as it discharged to other planets and through electrical discharges across the solar system. So, amazing amount of electrical activity also taking place. Now, you can imagine also, as Venus might approach, say, some small asteroids or minor planets, there would be a good deal of electrical discharge activity at that time too. So, the ancients saw this. They saw the Jupiter, of course, now is more active, so it's throwing lightning bolts across the sky to Mars. And the ancients saw this. So all of this activity starts with the entrance of Venus the comet. And as I said, this has the ancients' attention. What's going on? What's that thing there? What's happening? So now, Venus moves around, and remember that in an orbit out there, Jupiter has an orbit of about 10 years, 10 Earth years of our years right now. So Venus would have probably had some kind of elliptical orbit, maybe a 6 or 8 year elliptical orbit around the Sun. And also, because of the large comet tail that Venus has now produced through the discharge of the solar capacitor, that produces the tail drag on the comet. So Venus starts very slowly, orbit after orbit, maybe remember, it's maybe an 8-year orbit, so 8, 16, 24, 32. After maybe let's say 200 years of this, Venus starts to work its way into the orbit of Mars. All of a sudden, Venus, which by now is bigger than Mars because it's been attracting all this material, Venus is physically bigger, the nucleus that is, of Venus the comet is physically bigger than the planet Mars. But another thing is going on. Remember that the ancients also saw that Mars was a blue planet. Mars was a blue planet, and it was just like Earth. It was a water planet. And there's a lot of evidence that it had a good deal of life on it, maybe even human life that was exchanged. Those civilizations could have had plenty of time back then to develop and become spacefaring. Something that we would be very close to being a spacefaring, able to get to other planets, if it weren't for our illustrious space agency that really prevents us from getting into space, the NASA Space Agency. has more intent on keeping us from going into space than from getting us into space. And that's all political. I'm not going to go there. But the ancients, there are indications historically that there were spacefaring civilizations before the Great Catastrophe, and they in fact had visited Mars, and Mars was a civilization, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But the point is that Mars was a blue planet. Mars was a water planet, and so here comes Venus. You can imagine the discharges starting to snap, the electrical discharges between Venus and the planet Mars. So they're watching this and going, whoa, this is not good. Mars is being pounded by this thing. And so they have to be wondering about this time, is this thing going to continue on and affect us? Is this some kind of monster moving through the solar system that's going to come in and attack all the planets? And in fact, it was. And in fact, the Kolbrin, which is a book carried over from the ancient times, it in fact talks about the monsters, the big multiple comets in the sky. And so let me just add in that little piece of information right now. The Kolbrin is one of the clearest books on multiple big comets up in the sky at one time. The cover of my Planet X Comets and Earth Changes book has the picture of the petroglyph down in the southwestern U.S. at Green River, Utah, showing two large comets. Now, whether it was the same comet drawn twice, or whether there were two large comets at the same time in the solar system is hard to say, but they are very definitely large comets. But the point is, from a lot of other references, it's very clear that there were multiple large comets in the solar system at the same time back then when Venus was meandering through the solar system. So now we're probably, let's say by the time Venus encounters Mars, we're a couple hundred years into this process. Now that's important to remember. This stuff doesn't happen overnight. So you have a very long track record of people who are very tuned with the patterns of the heavens, and Mars and the orbit of the moon and Jupiter. They're very tuned to these patterns. They are very regular patterns, and here you have something that is not following a pattern. It's changing. They can't quite get their handle on this, so the term the lawless one is developed. The lawless one is the comet that does not obey the regularity laws of the solar system, of the measurement of periods of orbits and crossings of Earth and alignments of Earth with other objects out in outer space, etc. So we're dealing with a very lawless or abnormal orbital type of movement. And of course, it's unsure whether the ancients understood the significance of orbits, or did they just think these were plastered up there on the firmament. They may have had a little better understanding of that back then than what we call the ancients, the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Mesopotamians and all of the Babylonians. All those ancients who studied astrology and astronomy did measurements early in what we call the earliest civilizations, which were really, in some cases, a little bit before the disaster or a little bit after. And so they were very tuned to this thing called Venus. The precursors to the Mayan living in Mexico were very tuned to it. That became the central part of their religion, basically. Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god of the night sky, whose heart became eventually the planet Venus. So anyway, Zimbabwe, there were some records of charting of the planet Venus. And so anyway, the point is, yes, the ancients noticed this thing. Yes, it was doing strange things. And now here we are a few hundred years into this process, and this thing is approaching Mars. And just understand that Venus's orbit probably crossed the orbit of Mars, so that encounter was inevitable. that encounter was going to happen. Statistically, it was going to happen, and it was just a matter of time. So it may have taken Venus, 5, 10 more orbits before Mars and it finally hooked up. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why, as I explained last year, any object, if there were a Planet X object, say, let's say on a 5,000-year orbit, and say this object crossed Earth's orbit, the two orbits intersected, in other words, it may be thousands of years before those two objects finally come in proximity of each other because of the way they move around in their orbits. They're not going to encounter each other every time that let's say, period of each of the objects. So on to Venus. Okay, so all of a sudden here we have Venus, the comet, with its nucleus larger than that of Mars. And that's important because we know that Mars lost its atmosphere. So that the object that came by had to be bigger at that time. So Venus was already fairly well developed as a planet, probably bigger than Mars, with the surface gravity that was bigger than Mars, because when they finally came close and connected electrically, then all of that water and atmosphere was literally sucked off the surface of Mars. And all of the references back then, by the way, are referring to a snake-like phenomenon. And interesting enough, if you take my Planet X Comets and Earth Changes book and look on the cover, there's a snake-like thing on the cover, or on that picture, and it's like you took your hand and put it with all four fingers tight together. Put it around a tennis ball, and you held that tennis ball out at arm's length, and your fingers and your fingers is around one side, your thumb is around the other side, so it looks like a snake kind of grabbing on to Mars. And that was probably what it looked like, and this was all electrical. The electrical discharge to Mars, and then the auroras up in the upper atmosphere of Mars looked as if it were a snake with its hand, or with its mouth, so to speak, wrapped around Mars. This is what the ancients saw. And when this activity was finished, they realized that Mars was now a red planet. It had lost all its water. And so that's an important issue just from a space science point of view. It's a very important issue because NASA is going to Mars going, where's all the water? And they're digging around here and there and saying, oh, well, maybe we'll find water under the permafrost, when there are immense amounts of landscape surface features that could have only been developed by moving water, large amounts of moving water, in fact. And they're very recent. So geologists are starting to realize this, and it's very difficult to feed any information back to the space scientists, because they are, all-knowing. They have these theories that Mars could have had water billions of years ago, but certainly not 4,000 years ago. They always have to put it out of sight, out of mind, and out of time, so that you imagine that the solar system formed all at one time billions of years ago, and nothing has happened since. That's the idea they're trying to pawn off on the public. And, of course, certainly not true. But now we're at the point where Venus, the comet, has encountered Mars, lifted its atmosphere and oceans off, and this has now become part of Venus. Venus just gobbled up all that material, and probably a lot of dust and other material along with it. This has now become part of Venus. Venus, by the way, at this point is a very hot planet. And in the state of formation, it's in the comet form. And in fact, it's a very energetic, let's put it that way, a very energetic entity, very hot, steaming hot, chemically active, and on its way to building up, drawing all that tail material in to become a major planet. And it's here. It's not going to go away.